Well, good morning. We're going to continue that very theme of goodness and mercy and grace this morning, but illustrated in the life of a person in the Bible who went on a journey of God's goodness and grace in her life. So we're going to turn to the book of Ruth. Lovely book, one of the great love stories of the Bible. And it's interesting, in the Hebrew Bible, I understand that for the Jews, this book didn't come after Joshua and Judges, but it came after Psalms and Proverbs. When you think of Proverbs 31 and the godly woman that's described there, this book follows on very beautifully as an illustration, an example of a woman who came to experience the very goodness and grace of God that we're talking about this morning. And through her life, she became a great blessing to others. But I think we should read some of the story. We won't read it all, and we may not get through the whole story today, but Ruth chapter 1, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem of Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem and Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died. So that the woman was left without her 2 sons, without a husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was, with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you've dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of a husband." She kissed them. They lifted up their voices and wept. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown?" Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceeding bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. And they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. She said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people, to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you, to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. Well, we want to pick up the story and continue this theme of goodness and grace that we've been singing about. In one sense, the word grace actually isn't mentioned in this book. But there is a very similar word. It's mentioned 3 times, the Hebrew word chesed, which has been translated in Ruth 1:8, may the Lord deal kindly with you. It's that sense of kindness of the Lord. Ruth 2 verse 20, blessed be the Lord whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. And Ruth 3 verse 10, Boaz says to Ruth, you have shown kindness to me. And it's a word that occurs right through the Old Testament, particularly in the Psalms. God's kindness, his loving kindness, his mercy endureth forever, his goodness, his unfailing love, his faithful love. God is plenteous in mercy, and so forth, many times through the Bible. And we've been singing about that this morning. But I wonder whether we're experiencing that life of mercy and kindness and goodness day by day, his grace. And this book of Ruth does give us a picture. It's like when you are in the Grampians, if you love going to the Grampians like we do, you go up to the top of Baroka Lookout and you look down on the little town of Hall's Gap, spread out before you, and you can see in one sweep the panorama of that town and the landscape surrounding it. You can even see the track that winds up, that takes you to the top. And so we want to look at Ruth's life briefly today as it opens up before us, and we get some encouragements to help us in our journey, because we're on a journey in life, a journey of faith by grace, by the chesed of God, by his mercy and his loving kindness. We're going to see the pathway of God's grace, then some possibilities of God's grace, and finally the purposes of God's grace as we go on this journey with Ruth. The pathway of God's grace. Have you been bushwalking? I'm sure you have. Maybe in the Adelaide Hills, the Hyson Trail, some of these places, and you're not really following any map, you're just following the little signs. There are little markers along the way, and suddenly you come to a fork in the road. Uh-oh. There's an arrow going that way, there's another track going that way. Now, I'm not sure which way we should go. One seems to go up somewhere and one seems to go down somewhere. 2 very distinct ways to take, quite different pathways, and possibly very different destinations. And Ruth, our character, had come to such a fork in the road in her life. And we read it just now in Ruth 1. You see, she lived in the time of the judges. There was no king in Israel. It was a period of difficulty, discouragement, and defeat, actually, for God's people. One of the lowest points in the history of God's people. And she wasn't even a Jew. She was a Moabitess. And they were descendants from Lot. You might remember from back in Genesis. And they had forsaken the God of Abraham and come to worship a different God and to live their own way. And here we have 3 sad, somber women who are facing choices. Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And here they were at a crossroads. And we find Orpah taking a choice to return home to her family. And she wanted to find perhaps another husband or a relative to look after her. Ruth, of course, returning home with Naomi, empty hands, empty home, empty heart. But she decides to make a different choice. Entreat me not to leave thee or to forsake from following after thee. That wonderful declaration of resolve for her to say to Naomi, Even though I've experienced the hand of disappointment and tragedy, instead of turning against God, your God, I'm going to follow him and make him my God. Your God shall be my God. She was choosing the pathway of kindness and mercy that we've been speaking about, and grace. Makes me think of two possible applications for us today. One is the choice that we all face, particularly young people here today, the choice of God's way, the narrow way, and the broad way that the world is taking all around you. Many voices on life's journey, all calling for you to follow them. The social media voices, the media, your friends, even family. Sporting heroes, fashion heroes, the gods of the finance world. They're all calling. But the book of Proverbs says there is a call to the pathway of wisdom. Proverbs 4, verse 7. Solomon says that wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore get wisdom, and with all you're getting, get understanding. Take fast hold of instruction, God's instruction. Do not let her go. Keep her, for she is thy life. Very clearly says, enter not the path of the wicked. Avoid it. Don't even pass by it. Turn away from it. The path of the just is as the shining light, like the dawn of day that shines brighter and brighter until the fullness of day. My son, attend unto my words, and incline thine ear unto my sayings, for they are life unto those who find them. Campbell Morgan was a great preacher of a century ago. He says when he left home as a young man to go out into the world, his father said, I want to give you a motto for life. And he simply gave him a verse from Proverbs, which was Proverbs 3 verse 6. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Well, God went on to bless that man. He became one of the great preachers of England of last century. You read some of his commentaries. He was used of God mightily. But what a motto. You can't give a young person a better motto than that. To reject the world's way and take God's pathway. And if you get God's way and you get the life of Christ, you have all you need in life, as we've been singing about this morning. So that's the first application. Young people particularly, here today. Be willing to relinquish your own way. Reject the world's way. And take his hand as he leads you into life. But a second application that I only came to really think about yesterday as I heard an illustration that I thought fitted where we were with Ruth, is the pathway, the fork in the road, that leads us to two different houses in our lives. We have the pathway of trusting that leads to the house of grace. And it's possible in the Christian life to take a pathway of pleasing, trying to please God and to please people. And it leads us to the room of good intentions. In a sense, both pathways are needed in our lives. We do want to please God. We do want to trust God. But when you get to the rooms at the end of the pathway, you see the difference. You see, the room of good intentions is a good place. It looks good. There are good people there. Good Christian people there. Most of our churches have really good intentions. But you notice when you go in the door that they're actually all wearing masks. They're not COVID masks. They're things by which people can hide behind. And they want to hide the reality, the poverty of their experience of Jesus. And there are in this house of good intentions certain expectations that we want to live a certain way. There's certainly a sense of decorum and order, sense of fine disciplines in the Christian life, but there's no real reality of the Lord Jesus. And there's certainly no openness and honesty about how we're really going in our Christian lives. And if you take a reading of the temperature, there's a certain amount of intensity in the room as people seek to strive to please the church or the leaders or God himself. They know he loves them. God loves them. But there's a sense that the amount of his love for them is dependent on how their Christian life is going, how they perform in everyday life when they don't mess up. But at least we keep trying with our good intentions. The other room is the room of grace, which you get via a different pathway, the pathway of trust. You notice that in this room, when you go in, it's a bit messy, it's a bit disordered, it's a bit loud. Instead of intensity, though, there's liberty. And there's openness and honesty. There's no masks. People are quite willing to be vulnerable and trust one another. There's no fear. But there is love and joy and peace and truth. And the people actually believe that God loves them even if they do mess up. There's a sense of this loving kindness and mercy and unfailing love that we've been singing about. God actually delights in you, no matter how you feel about yourself or how other people see you. And people are living and journeying in the grace of God through Jesus. And they're learning to walk life's journey by faith in the one who loved them and gave himself for them. One life is resolved about resolving, and the other's focused on responding. It's a response of love to the one who loved me and gave himself for me. The question is not so much where are you at the fork in the road, but which house have you gone to live in as a Christian? And how you might get from one room to the other if you're in the house of good intentions and you want to be in the house of God's grace, his kindness, mercy. And there is a track that runs between the two houses. You don't see it from the main road. But if you follow it, it takes you up a hill. You come to a cross. And you take a step back and you see Jesus there on the cross dying for you. As the hymn that we used to sing, beneath the cross of Jesus, I fain would take my stand, the shadow of a mighty rock within a weary land, a home within a wilderness, a rest upon the way from the burning of the noontide heat and the burden of the day. And upon that cross of Jesus, mine eye at times can see the very dying form of one who suffered there for me. And from my stricken heart with tears, two wonders I confess, the wonders of redeeming love and my unworthiness. You see, we need to go back to that place regularly, to the cross. And we hear him say, I love you. And from that place, we go further up the track and we come to a rock. And we stand on that rock, and it's the rock of God's love. In fact, there's a verse in 1 John 4, verse 16, which I marked this morning, which simply says, when you come to this place, you can say this: we've come to know and to believe the love that God has for us. Do you know that? Do you know that love? Can you stand on that rock no matter what you're going through, and no matter what you feel about yourself or what others may say about you, and you can say, I know the love that he has for me. You take that pathway a little further, leads you to, from the house of good intentions into that doorway of the house of grace. And you find in there the life of the Spirit. And when you read Galatians chapter 5, in fact, when you read the book of Galatians, you can start to get a sense of the two houses of legalism and bondage, and then the house of liberty and grace. And in chapter 5, Paul says, you're called to freedom, brothers. Through love, serve one another. The whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbour as yourself. Verse 16, I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh. And then in verse 18, if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. It goes on to describe the works of the flesh. Then the wonderful fruit of the Spirit: love and joy and peace and patience and kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also walk by the Spirit. If by the Spirit you have come as a Christian into life, then live your daily life in that realm of the Spirit, Paul is saying. Ordering your steps being governed by the Spirit. The decisions, the reactions, the responses, the impulses by the Spirit. And the righteous requirements of the law, the demands of the law, are all fulfilled in us who live by the Spirit, against which there is no law. Against that person there is no law. There's no sense of obligation to have to live up to a certain standard, except a response of God's love and the leading of the Spirit. Probably got a little bit off track there with Ruth. But it's the fork in the road, you see, and it leads you to think about where we are this morning in our Christian life on this journey. The pathway of God's grace, where he takes you by the hand. Possibilities of God's grace, where he leads you on. Yeah, what a wonderful story. We don't have time to to read it all, but in Ruth chapter 2, here she is in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Naomi had a relative, her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So remember, Elimelech was Naomi's husband. Here's a relative of him. And Ruth says to Naomi one day, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain." She said, "Go, my daughter." And she set out and went. And she gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Wow. Here is a wonderful example of God's grace. Someone has said the Christian life is just a series of new beginnings. A new start, a new beginning for Ruth. Where do I go now? How will it work out? She's stateless, she's husbandless, she is childless, she's moneyless, she's clueless. But she set out and went. She happened to come to part of the field belonging to Boaz. God's provision for her needs. Food, water, friendship, generous gleanings from the barley harvest. God's protection. A place for her right then. Place of rest, a safe shelter. What a story. Boaz, older man, surprised by love. And Ruth, overwhelmed by God's chesed, his loving kindness, his favour, his kindness, his loving kindness, his unfailing love as a Gentile. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 9, who what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 9, you say, yes, that's Ruth, but what about me? You don't know how difficult a situation I face. It's not only perplexing, it seems impossible. How am I supposed to trust and walk this road of God's grace? Isaiah 50 says, who among you fears the Lord and obeys the voice of his servant? So surely that's a person of blessing. Surely they'll have joy and light. He goes on to say, let him who thus walks in darkness and has no light trust in the name of the Lord and rely on his God. Trust when I cannot see. Hudson Taylor, a great man of faith who started the China Inland Mission. Near the end of his life, it was 1899, 1900, and the Boxer Rebellion had taken hold of China. And this was a rebellion that reacted against Western influences in China. And so Westerners were targeted, especially missionaries. And he witnessed in his mission dozens of his faithful missionaries slaughtered and their children by the Chinese. Many were captured. And he kept hearing the bad news. More bad news. And he said one day, I cannot read, I cannot think, I cannot even pray. But I can trust. I can trust. And it was he who had proven God's faithfulness all his life. In fact, it was Hudson Taylor who said from Mark 11 that faith is simply laying hold of the faithfulness of God. Sometimes we come to this place of silence. Heaven seems to be silent. And we just need to seek God and to wait upon God. And trusting God often involves waiting. Ruth had to learn to wait. Because as we read how it all transpired for her in chapters 3 and 4, Naomi, of course, cottoned onto the fact that here was an opportunity for them. There could be a match here between Ruth and Boaz. And there was a certain way, a certain tradition that had to be followed from Deuteronomy called the kinsman redeemer application, that where there was a redeemer who could redeem a woman who'd lost a husband, they would have to cast themselves upon such a one. And so as a near relative, Boaz could actually redeem Elimelech's family, including Ruth. And he'd probably mortgaged the land when he took his family out of Israel to Moab. And here was Boaz, a rich man who could actually buy that back. But with the land came the woman. He had to marry her, bring up the children bearing the name of the deceased. So Naomi says, Ruth, this is possible, but you have to go to Boaz. And she organised for him to go at night. She found him in his threshing house, threshing his wheat. And according to the law, she had to lie at his feet. No sense of impurity here. This is simply propriety and humility. And she asks Boaz to spread his mantle over her, which was a sign that he would be willing to claim her as his wife, which he does. But of course, there's a possible hiccup. He realises there's someone who is a closer relative than he is, who has a first claim on this beautiful woman. And in chapter 4, if we had the time, we'd see that love does find a way, and God's sovereignty finds a way. He finds this near kinsman and he says, look, here's the proposition. You've got to buy Ruth if you buy the land. And he says to Boaz, well, thank you, but I can't redeem her because I have a wife already. And if I take Ruth as my wife, I fear that there could be additional claimants to my inheritance and my property, which I'm not prepared to accept. You redeem Ruth. You have no wife. You have no impediments. And so as you follow the story through, like the TV dramas, when you're waiting to see what's going to happen with this girl and this man who've come together, will this blossom into romance and marriage? And so we read in Ruth 4:13, Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. Phew! But the possibilities, you see, the possibilities of God's grace. The book opens with 3 funerals. And it finishes with a wedding. It opens with somberness and sadness, and it closes with rejoicing and song. There's a note of bitterness at the start, and yet it ends with a chord of blessing. Instead of the unfaithfulness of God's people, we have the loyalty and devotion of a woman of faith and courage. See the possibilities of God's goodness and his unfailing love for a life that's willing to abandon their plans and to trust God to the end. Willing to wait for God and his purposes. Yes, the pathway of God's grace, the possibility of God's grace, but finally the purposes of God's grace. As we know Romans 8:28, we often say it, together all things work together for good to them who love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. His purpose is to make us like Jesus, it says in Romans 8:29, to be conformed to the image of God's dear Son. 2 Timothy 1:9 says, who saved us and called us with a holy calling, not because of our works, but according to his own purpose and grace. And Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, and the Lord gave conception, and she bore a son. And they called his name Obed. which in the Hebrew I understand means one who serves, serving. And he was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. Obed, even though he didn't realise it as a little baby, he served God's purposes. He was a source of blessing to Boaz, to Ruth, to Naomi, to the people of Bethlehem, even to the nation of Israel. Elimelech's name in Hebrew means my God is king. And there was no king. But through Obed, David the king would come. And through the coming of Jesus, he was a blessing to the world. See, the purposes of God's grace in Ruth's life are that the Gentiles, and she was one of them, are not outside the scope of God's redeeming love. And they were far above these purposes what she could have imagined. Ruth, a Moabite Gentile, once a heathen, becomes the great-grandmother of King David, as she's included in the genealogy of Jesus. See, Ruth and Boaz, in their union with one another, constituted a channel for God's grace, for the accomplishment of his greater purposes, which they couldn't see. And for you and me today, this grace has purpose. As John prayed earlier in our prayer session, not only that we'd become more and more like Jesus, but that we would be a channel for his grace to others. And all he needs is a yielded vessel. He just needs a foothold in your life. That you'd become this channel of blessing to others. And that he would make possible the things that you cannot even imagine, far above all that you can ask or think. For the purpose of his glory. And it all starts when we take him by the hand at that fork in the road. And we go on this journey on the pathway of grace. And we dwell in the household of grace. Will you take his hand this morning? Maybe take it afresh. Go with him to that hill. Spend some time there. And renew your love. And feel his love for you and his goodness. His mercy. His kindness. We're going to sing about that now in our last hymn. One man who took hold of God's hand was Ron Hamilton. He is still alive. He lives in America. He owns Majesty Music, in fact, and he's a songwriter, a music publisher. But at age 28, back in the late 70s, he received news that he had cancer in his eye. And he lost that eye, and he had to wear a patch, and still wears one. He became known as Ron the Patch Hamilton, I think. But he wrote this hymn, Rejoice in the Lord, based on Job 23:10. He knows the way that I take, and when he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. He had a son who struggled with mental health, and his son took his life just a few years ago. But he's walking the pathway of grace. And we want to join in singing together his hymn now as we finish together.
Thank you, Robert. God never moves without purpose or plan. Let's stand to sing.